Hello and welcome to this special edition of the broadcast. My name is Mohammed Saleh. When Volodymyr Zelensky met with the American President Donald Trump at the White House earlier in the week, the one thing that was pretty evident was that the Ukrainian president was now pretty keen on striking a peace deal, even if it meant ceding territory to Russia. But what is also important to highlight is that while the Ukrainian president has expressed his willingness to draw down this war, there's been no indication on the ground that Russia would also like to bring an end to the war. So what really is Russia's game plan at the moment? And what more gains is Russia looking to acquire militarily on the ground in Ukraine? To discuss this, we've got with us Dr. Glen, who's a professor of international relations at the University of Southeastern Norway and also an editor at the Russia in Global Affairs journal. Professor Deisen, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on WION. Now, this, of course, is the big question, is it not? Now, ever since Volodymyr Zelensky has made it abundantly clear that he wants to now strike a peace deal, the fact is on the ground, there is no ceasefire, and the Russians are clearly hinting and stating in as many words. For instance, Sergei Lavrov has said it openly that the Ukrainians, even now, do not appear to be ready for a peace deal. What do you make of these developments?
Well, it's important to distinguish between the ceasefire and a peace deal, because a ceasefire doesn't actually address any of the political settlement. It merely holds the fighting. So for the Russians, ceasefire is completely out of the question, because, well, the only reason why the NATO countries and Ukraine are even considering now the Russian demands is because the Russian victories on the front lines. So if they would stop these attacks, there would be no need for Zelensky and the Europeans especially to actually make a deal with Russia. And I think this is why Trump, after the meeting with Putin in Alaska, accepted this condition that there wouldn't be a ceasefire. Instead, there would have to be a political settlement before the fighting begins. So, and given that the Russians and Americans are on the same page in terms of rejecting a ceasefire and instead addressing the root causes, which is NATO expansion and well, any NATO involvement in Ukraine and of course, these territorial concessions. So until this has been resolved, I don't think there would be an end to the fighting.
Now, those who are a little cynical of the position that Russia has taken, some of them would in fact turn around and say the reason why the Russians would not agree to a ceasefire is because it clearly suits what they want to do. That is to say, Russia wants to acquire more and more territory on the ground militarily, and at the same time, it can also continue with these negotiations for a deal. But on the ground, though, it is taking up and gobbling up more of the Ukrainian land. Is this what you think the Russian approach to this war now is?
Well, I think the Russians were quite clear or consistent over the past 3 years what it demanded. And this hasn't changed at all. They want Ukraine to restore its neutrality and also have these territorial concessions. But the neutrality also entails some limits on security guarantees. Now, you said that Zelensky have communicated clearly that he wants a peace deal, but a peace deal, it depends what he means, because he has not accepted Russia's demand for a peace deal, which is he hasn't accepted yet that there will be no NATO membership. He hasn't accepted that there can't be any NATO presence on the Ukrainian territory, and he hasn't accepted the territorial agreements, which demands which the Russians have put forward. Now, I think so far what the Russians were willing to compromise on was the territory. They need Ukraine to leave Donbass, but they're willing to freeze the front line in Kherson and Zaporozhye. And I think if these three demands are met, I think the war would be over. But Zelensky is in a difficult position because he has to show to Trump that he's willing to make peace. Otherwise, Trump will use a lot of pressure against him. On the other hand, he doesn't see that he's in a position yet to actually make these territorial concessions and also give up these demands for very powerful security guarantees.
Right. Now, security guarantees for Ukraine involves many things. A lot of stuff has been said. Initially, there was this idea which Donald Trump also seemed to agree, that he could allow US soldiers to be there on the ground in Ukraine. But then he later said that, of course, the American soldiers are not going to be there on the ground in Ukraine. The British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has floated this idea of a coalition of the willing, where troops of Britain, France and a few other willing nations could be stationed in a buffer zone between Russia and Ukraine. In your assessment, what kind of security guarantees would be acceptable for the Ukrainians and would also be acceptable for the Russians?
Well, that's that's a difficult position they're in, because for the Russians it would be completely unacceptable to have soldiers from NATO countries in Ukraine. From their perspective, preventing this was why they invaded to begin with. So they can't have NATO then entering the country in a peace agreement when this was the source of the conflict to begin with. Because from their perspective, the war isn't really that much about Ukraine. It's a wider conflict between NATO and Russia over the past 30 years, as NATO has incrementally moved towards the Russian borders. But it's a great question you have, because at the moment, once NATO began to make its incursion into Ukraine in 2014, this was seen by the Russians as being an existential threat. That is, NATO in Ukraine is an existential threat to Russia. So Russia took actions against Ukraine. Now Russia is an existential threat to Ukraine. So you have, this makes it very difficult to solve, but just logic dictates that any solutions can't simply be NATO taking part of what would be essentially big peacekeepers, because this is, as many have recognized, like Leon Panetta and others, Boris Johnson, this is a proxy war between NATO and Russia. So even though Trump would like to present himself as a mediator, it doesn't actually mean that he is. He's also very much deeply involved in this war.
You know, no question about it that the United States, just by virtue of the fact that it has been supplying weapons and intelligence for the Ukrainians in this war, is deeply involved. But the question is also this: Donald Trump, since his meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky, has now indicated that it would be best for Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky to meet between the two of them without him being present. Do you think Donald Trump is now trying to look for a certain kind of an exit with which he can distance himself from these negotiations?
Well, definitely. I think what he's essentially putting forth is what the dilemma he's said all along, that is, make a peace, and if a peace is not possible, then we're gone. And if the Europeans and the Europeans keep pushing back against what Trump is trying to do, so if there's no possible peace, then he can walk away from this, and as this disaster unfolds, he can say, well, it's not my mistake, I tried to do everything I could. It's the mistake of the Europeans. So I think this is, well, for him, a good approach, because it either gets peace or at least gets to wash America's hands with this. So I do think that this is probably what is thinking. But it's hard to imagine Zelensky and Putin meeting, though, until they actually have an agreement, because otherwise it would just be theatrics. So I think once they have the two main components accepted, that is, Ukraine remains neutral, and this puts strict limitations on what security guarantees can actually mean, and of course the territorial concessions. Right. So there are some
possibilities. Now, my final question to you, Professor Deisen, is this: the Ukraine war in many ways has changed the security calculus for the European continent, because the European nations, as part of the NATO military alliance, were pretty happy sitting underneath the umbrella of the American security cover. But that seems to have weakened in this Ukraine war. It has clearly shown the limitations of what NATO can actually do, even though Ukraine is not a part of the NATO military alliance. How do you think the Europeans will now, reassess their own security calculus in the aftermath of what's happened in Ukraine?
Well, I think that's one of the main concerns of the Europeans. Again, this is not all about Ukraine. The United States has signaled very clearly wants to pivot to Asia. If you pivot to somewhere, you have to pivot away. And Europe is no longer a priority, as the Americans keep saying. So the Americans would like to end their involvement in Ukraine so they can also pull out to a larger extent from Europe. So from the European perspective, it's a very dangerous situation, because for the past 3.5 years, the Europeans have participated in a proxy war which has killed tens of thousands of Russians Russians, knowing that America has their back and supporting them. Now, of course, they realize that the war has been lost and America will try to pull out of Ukraine and Europe, and suddenly that leaves the Europeans very exposed. So they're now concerned that this conflict could to get out of control. So the entire ability of NATO to survive this is also in question. So there's a lot of uncertainty, which is why it's a very dangerous situation, which again should take into account the security concerns of all, the Russians, Ukrainians, and the Europeans for that sake as well.
Indeed, I think that's a crucial aspect of this entire conflict. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Deisen, for joining us with that perspective there.